The following is part of Cornell Contemporary China Initiative Lecture Series under the Cornell East Asia program. The arguments and viewpoints of this talk belong solely to the speaker. We hope you enjoy.
Welcome to the Cornell Contemporary China Initiative Lecture Series. My name is Mario Du. I teach Qing and Republican China at the Department of History here at Cornell University. I'm serving as the director of the CCCI series in fall 2023 with the theme, The Central State and All Under Heaven. Launched in 2015, this lecture series has brought hundreds of leading scholars from various disciplinary backgrounds to share their cutting-edge research on China with Cornell students, faculty, and the general public. This series is sponsored by the East Asia program. Here, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the co-sponsors of this series in fall 2023. The Levinson China and Asia Pacific Studies Program, the Department of History, and the Society for the Humanities at Cornell. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today. Professor Huang Yanjie is a senior tutor at the Chinese Studies Department, National University of Singapore. He received his PhD in History and East Asian Studies from Columbia University in 2021 and was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University before joining NUS as a faculty member this fall. Professor Huang's first book, Market in State, The Political Economy of Domination in China, is co-authored with Professor Zheng Yongnian and published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. It studies the origins of China's contemporary state-dominated economy from the late imperial period to the reformist era. Professor Huang is currently working on his second monograph, A Revolution Domesticated, Negotiating Family Life in Urban China, 1959 to 1984, which is based on his dissertation research. It traces Xiaokang, contemporary China's ideology of depoliticized family-state synergy to urban family life under the Maoist economic policy of revolutionary austerity, deploying family ladders as a primary source of PRC history. This book provides a rare bottom-up view of China's political transformations in the 1960s and the 1970s. Professor Huang's talk today, Geopolitics, Mobilization, and the Communist Monetary System in Manchuria, 1945 to 1949, is related to his third book project on state surveillance of information control in Mao's China and Professor Huang's long-term interest in Chinese economic history. Now, let us welcome Professor Huang with warmest applause. Virtual applause. And Professor Huang, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Mara, for the generous introduction. And I also want to thank Amala for setting all this up, and also everyone for coming to my talk. So my talk today is actually a part of the first brief summary. This is my practice of doing a brief summary before diving into a more or less complicated topic. So first, I'll give a broader overview of PRC early monetary history, which is my current book project. And then I will provide some historical context of CCP-KMT struggle for Manchuria, which is the key historical context of chapter 4 of this book. And then I will talk about the modern frontiers of Chinese civil war in Manchuria, which gives the immediate historical context of the monetary revolution that I'm talking about today. And then I will go to the main thing of today, that is how the CCP, with its party state and army, engineered a monetary revolution in Dongbei, which is also known as Manchuria, during the Civil War era. I will briefly go through the preconditions of success, the command structure and the grand strategies of the CCP, and how these strategies were operationalized on an everyday basis. So basically, this talk is drawn from my current book project which is tentatively entitled Geopolitics, War Economy, and the Making of Renminbi. So So the basic argument of this book is that renminbi has its origin and its theoretical, also more importantly, practical basis in the logics of, it's a bit complicated, maybe just logic of Chinese wartime logistics that we can study in the context of shifting geopolitics and also the CCP's physical military operations, mainly in the 1940s, but also in the 1930s and 50s. So I will first talk about additional origins of the revolution, and then go through the first two periods of the revolution, that is the Chinese Soviets in the 1930s, and the Sino-Japanese War, which is very important for the formation of the whole system. So this chapter, this talk is drawn from the fourth chapter, which also is very pivotal in the development of this system, that is in Manchuria between 1945 and 1950. And of course, there will be other chapters which still needs to be completed, dealing with how the system actually got institutionalized in China, and what we know as the renminbi eventually spread from Shanghai, right, from North China to Shanghai, then to the Tibetan plateau, and how it interacts with what we know as the Bretton Woods system, and how it lead in one way or another to the tragedies of the Great Leap Forward. So of course, the history of renminbi, or the history of the monetary history of CCP, is very long and complicated. But why do we specifically emphasize the Manchuria experience? Why do we zoom in into the period between 1945 and 1950 in Dongbei, what we know as Dongbei, right? First, there are a few things to bear in mind. First, because Manchuria is the region where the CCP, I'm talking about, of course, China's current ruling party, before it has founded the PRC, how it founded the first single currency regime that unified a mega economic region. So by mega economic region, I'm talking about a very vast collective of provinces, right? So before that, CCP as a political force does not really control very large tract of lands. So its economic regimes and its currencies operates only as district level, county level, or at most a provincial level. So Manchuria is where it really matured into a cross-regional, mega-regional currency. It's also crucible for top CCP financiers, so those leading officials who are in charge of the different ministries after the founding of PRC. So all these people, Chen Yun, Gao Gang, right, Ye Jizhuang, Wang Shoudao, Cao Juru, Zhu Lizhi, Li Fuchun, all these people work in Dongbei. They work in Manchuria during this period. And the experience in Manchuria contributed in one way or another to the various roles after the founding of PRC. As we know, the Chen Yun, the economic czar, right, Gao Gang, then as the first minister of, or the first director of the planning agency, Li Fuchun, the second director, and Ye Jizhuang, minister of commerce, and so on and so forth. All those people, they worked in one way or another in Dongbei during this period. And if we zoom out and look at the whole history of Chinese currency and Chinese monetary history, they had actually, in one or another, contributed to the development of first stable Chinese PRC currencies at the Shanghaning area, when Communist China was based in Yan'an and its surrounding areas. And then some of those people, they moved to northeast, to Manchuria, to build to form the physical economic commission of Manchuria. And then after that, they become officials of the founding of PRC. So we can see how Manchuria was really a historical linchpin between the Yan'an experience and the later experience. Manchuria is also a very critical step in the development of a physical military model of the PRC, of the CCP, and then the PRC, of course. And then it's also one of the most important example of the very first integration of China with the Soviet economic sphere. I think some of you might know that Manchuria, because it's adjacent to the Soviet Union, was the first part of China that has borrowed the Soviet planning techniques, become a planned economy, and it's also, as probably fewer people will know, also the first region that was tightly integrated by trade into the Soviet economic sphere, even before the founding of PRC. So all these made it very unique and very important in the whole history of the CCP economic system, and especially its monetary system. So before I actually go into the Manchuria experience, let me give a brief historic review, overview of how the CCP monetary system actually developed. So I have covered the summary, right, of the overview of this talk. And I just gave an outline of the book project where the talk is located. So we're talking about chapter 4, right? Chapter 4 of this book, Monetary Revolution in Manchuria, and why the Manchuria experience is especially important for our understanding of the CCP's historical currency and how it evolved into renminbi. And now we are here, right? We're on this page where I'll briefly talk about the historical evolution of the PRC, of the CCP historical currencies. So, of course, before the CCP has established stronghold in Yan'an, it already had some kind of exposure, right, to physical military state building when it was trying to build those Soviets in South China. So, but I think to many people's surprise, in fact, even before that, there are people who are making the argument that China needs new fiat currency that is used for war mobilization. And the people who actually made this argument is Sun Yat-sen in 1913. So in 1913, Sun Yat-sen first raised the idea that in order to defend China against Tsarist Russia, China needed a new currency that was not backed by silver or gold, but backed by commodities. Because compared with silver and gold, where China has a shortage of, China has a lot of materials to be mobilized. And once those materials can be linked to the value of currencies, China can have a limited supply of currency, of money, in the war mobilization against a possible war with Tsarist Russia. So of course, some of those ideas are not Sun Yat-sen's own, but coming from old school economic statecraft that we can trace all the way back to Guanzi or Yan Tielun. And some of those that eventually came to the PRC experience were from the old peasant war model, where, some of you might know, that Taiping Rebellion used to practice the system of centralized control of commodities, right? And they actually issue some currencies based on those commodities. And more importantly, the CCP financiers, they learned from the hands-on experience from the Soviets and then from the revolutionary wars in the Yan'an period, but also in the Xibaipo period, but also in the Civil War period. So basically, the system had a long prehistory before the 1930s, and then it evolved gradually into a system that was more or less stabilized during the Sino-Japanese War. The Sino-Japanese War was a crucial period where eventually in areas like Shandong, CCP financiers like Muqiao, they built this idea of a localized money based on commodities. So in Shandong case is grain and salt. So basically, the local party state and army will collect a lot of rural surplus grain and salt, and they will build trade monopolies based on that, and they will ask that only the local CCP currencies can be used in exchange for those products. And in this way, somehow they stabilized the currency value of those particular local currencies amid hyperinflation, as we know. The whole period of the Sino-Japanese War, and also especially Civil War, is a period of hyperinflation. And in order to survive the hyperinflation, the CCP party states they build those mini bases with those currencies that has its value linked to commodities. So in those areas where the currency value were determined by commodities, the value of the currency tends to be more stable. First, of course, against the Fabi, and then sometimes against other currencies issued by Japanese or other local authorities. So after 1945, here we reach the Manchuria experience, right? There are certain kind of established principles where the CCP currencies operates. First, it served war and geopolitics. So the currency was exclusively or primarily designed for war mobilization. Secondly, it flexibly and adaptively use of market. So they use market when it's possible, and they use coercion when the market is not working in order to stabilize the values of currencies and in order to serve the war. And thirdly, they practice political centralization, but economic decentralization. So basically, every small district or basis have their own currencies. So even until 1947, on the eve of the CCP's conquest of Manchuria, there are around 20 currencies run by the CCP, where for the Kuomintang, they have only one currency in Manchuria. And that's how they actually operate. So every small area will have their own banks and currency. And eventually, when the army grows stronger and conquer all those land, they will consolidate those smaller currencies into just one single currency. And that's how eventually we have a RMB. And ultimately, there's also this principle of primacy of production control. So everything serves for the production and serves for the zero of material standard. The material of commodities is the king. As long as you have the commodities, you can set the price of commodities. You can stabilize the price. Okay. So just now, we're talking about how to fight inflation. So that's one of the very practical way of fighting inflation. If you have those commodities, right? At least you can stabilize the price of key commodities, and then you can achieve a moderate control over inflation. So basically, Manchuria in late 45 and early 46 is a very important and strategic area for control. I think it's needless to say, you all know about the basic geography of where Manchuria is, right? It's located at a conjunction of three important geopolitical blocks: the Korean Peninsula, the Soviet Siberia, and China proper, mainland China, right? So once you have those conjunctions of all those geopolitical interests, it becomes extremely important. So even under Japanese, Manchuria was developed into a industrial hub of China, with a bread basket, with a extremely powerful agricultural sector. It's a very extensive railway system, which for one time actually account for more than half of China's railway mileage. And it's thanks to Soviet aid for the CCP, because it's adjacent to the Soviet Union, which emerges as one of the most powerful countries after the Second World War. So basically, for the CCPs and also for the KMTs, whether for its material importance or for its symbolic value, Manchuria is a must-go. That's why after 1945, when the Japanese surrender, both the CCP and the KMT, they made all-out effort to seize the control of Manchuria at all cost. And also, we should not forget that before this struggle between the CCP and the KMT, Manchuria had a very long history of Japanese rule and a relatively brief but very intense period of Soviet military occupation. So all these left important institutional legacies on how the economies were run. So it's based on these interests and basic strategic considerations that both CCP and KMT, they devised different strategies to seize Manchuria. So for the CCP, they still employ some of the guerrilla tactics, hit and run. Sometimes they emphasize a lot of party building. They mobilize large troops from all over China to staff their rank of cadres. And they also employed a very flexible strategy. So if they cannot conquer certain land or hold certain land, they will just retreat, right? That's how we see that you use the rural hinterland to encircle the cities, right? So the city is not, of course, if you have to control the cities, the industrial resources, that's good. But if you cannot control them, you have to control the rural hinterland, the breadbasket. And opposite to the CCP, the KMT has a different strategy. So it seeks diplomatic recognition. So symbolic control is very important for them. And it relies a lot on their technological military superiority, especially with the American aid. They want to conquer the whole of Manchuria. Especially it's very important strategic cities, because that's where the heavy industry lies. That's where most of the assets were. And never forget, there's a Soviet factor. The Soviet Union, although it has retreated in 1946, it never really retreated. It never withdrew its forces. So it still controlled very large and strategic part of Manchuria. And that enabled the CCP to have access to very large market in Soviet Union and North Korea. So North Korea, by the way, is a vassal, vassal state status that is adjacent to Manchuria. Remember, North Korea is to the east and Soviet Union is to the north. So they can trade, right, both with Manchuria very frequently. So a second legacy that I want to emphasize is the Japanese legacy, which, to be more precise, is this chuka system that has been in existence for around the time of Japanese occupation of Manchuria, especially during the war. So how does this system actually work? So I'm not going into details of Japanese economic occupation because it's quite incremental. So the Japanese first came in 1950 in the aftermath of Russo-Japanese War, and they eventually established a puppet regime called Manchukuo, and then only in the 1940s it became extremely militarized because of the Pacific War. So during the Pacific War, where Japan has to fight both the United States and China, and also other Western powers, it has to mobilize all resources under its control. So it's under this system that the Japanese, they promoted this chuka system. So the chuka system means that there will be monopoly sales for all grain from the grain producing regions under the Japanese Empire to Japan and other part of the Japanese Empire that has a grain shortage. So as we know, in those areas under Japanese control, Manchuria, maybe Thailand, are the real, and part of the North Vietnam, are the real breadbasket, right? So sometimes, and the Manchuria, because it's easy access to sea, to Japan, is probably the place that is most heavily exploited for its natural resources, and especially its grain. So it's estimated that on average, 44% of Manchuria grain produced in the early 40s were eventually shipped forcibly to Japan and other parts of Japanese Empire. And how did the Japanese actually achieve that? They use a lot of local agents. They use the local landlords and local elites, the old elites, to coerce the peasants. So basically peasants, while they are poor, they sometimes have a much larger share of the chuga quotage. So basically, a lot of those peasants, they suffered much more miserably than the rich landlords who has all those methods to have a lower share of the so-called chuga grain contribution. So what is the consequence of that? We can imagine after the war, after the Japanese defeat, there will be a lot of political grievances, or let's say hatred, right, among the peasants. And that became a very important factor when the CCP came, because as they see it, it's a good opportunity to use this hatred, to use these grievances to mobilize the peasants against the former landlords or the other elites. The Soviet factor. So the Soviet factor is also very important, not just because the Soviet briefly occupied Manchuria, but more importantly, because the Soviet, even after the withdrawal, so this is a map showing how Soviet actually invaded Manchuria, let's say conquered Manchuria with the army. It's a very large army of over 1 million. And then they were stationed all those important cities along the railway. But even after the retreat in March 1946, they still occupied a very strategic area here called Arthur, right, or today's Dalian. So once they controlled this area, they also controlled the adjacent areas. So as we will learn during this the Civil War, especially in the first and the second phase, when the KMT actually controlled South Manchuria, this area and its port were still accessible to the communists. Whether they want to ship the grain to Soviet Union or they want to do trade with North Korean, they can always use this place as one of their springboard, because it basically became a Soviet enclave in the KMT-controlled region. So the CCP were never short of Soviet support, especially after 1947, because the Soviet had a stronghold in Dalian. So the military situation of the civil war in Manchuria is a very long story, so I'm not going into detail, but we can divide the whole period of 1945 to 1948 or 1949 into 3 periods. The first period is, let's say, the first round, right, of the struggle. Is when both CCP and the KMT mobilized troops to Manchuria. And it ended with the KMT's partial triumph, because the KMT definitely, they had Americans' help. They had more organized army, more modern equipment. So eventually, they were able to take all those major cities south of Songhua River. So most major cities were, especially the railway, was taken by the KMT by the middle of 1946. And then the second round, which is the one that I want to focus on, from middle of 1946 to the end of 1947, is when the war between KMT and CCP troops were sort of stabilized, right? But in fact, it's only the visible line, but behind those lines, the CCP actually consolidated the control of North Manchuria, and eventually, bit by bit, they eventually take all those surrounding rural hinterlands along the railways, and eventually surrounded the KMT troops in the big cities. So the first period of war ended with the KMT's partial success, and the second round of war, CCP had a success, and eventually turned tide of the war, of course, because by 1945 and by 1948, the CCP eventually had a final victory. Because not just because of what events in Manchuria, when they eventually took all those hinterlands, they eventually surrounded all those enclaves, but more importantly, because the KMT lost the war elsewhere, and not just in military front, but also in economic front. So by 1948, everything is pretty clear that, at least for Manchuria, the civil war is going to end with the CCP success. So how did CCP actually achieve those degree of success? Both in the military, but also in the economic front. So I think it's useful to look at how its economy was organized around its military. So basically, this is how it's very simple graph illustrating how the CCP economic bureaucracy and the military bureaucracy actually sort of intertwined. They are both under the control of the Dongbei Bureau, which is a chief representative, local representative of the party. And the party has a physical and economic committee, which is chiefly responsible for all the economic spheres. And then it has banks, trade bureaus, commerce bureaus, and then it has all those branches. But the important thing to remind is that this whole system exists alongside the military system. So sometimes you will see that the military bureaucracy and the physical economic bureaucracy are the same. So there can be some people, say, department head of the military logistics. So this person is also in charge in economic physical affairs as a key member of the vice chairman of the physical economic committee. So all the decisions making were made in these two levels, right? At the bureau level and all at the committee level. So the military and the military operations and the economic operations, they go hand in hand. So the basic operational principle is that they see military economic as inseparable, and the economic operations were part of the military, in fact. So economic as logistics. They were total political military command of the economy, right? So the whole economy was under this committee, and this committee was staffed most by the military men, and also by the party boss and by all other members of the leaders of the bureaus. But eventually they were answerable to the Northeast Bureau, which is chiefly responsible for conducting the war. They were central control of critical commodities. So grain was centrally coordinated in this region, in this whole region, under the control. They have a production-centered tax system, and let's say not just tax, but also the bank system. They serve to promote production. The whole system was meant to stimulate more industrial and agricultural production, and eventually all those surplus will go back into circulation to support the currency. And it has very strict logistics rules of provision. That is, say, everybody entered in the Northeast liberated area. That's the common name for the region under the CCP. They have kind of a status, whether you're peasants, you're soldiers, you're cadres, you're workers. So you have kind of a ration, right? You have a role to play. You have a part of you have a ration, and you have a obligation to fulfill. And who will get more? It really depends how you contribute to the war. So the soldiers, those in the front, will definitely get more. And while those were were working on the back, right, who is working for the logistics, who are working for the factories, they will get less. And the peasants, despite their status being the producer of the grain, they will get even less as producers. And in terms of monetary and trade policy, it also has some very interesting features. So first, as I have already talked about, the currency was backed by commodities. So commodities is the king, right? Grain is the king. So because of the monopoly of grain, it can stabilize, at least for the time being, price of key commodities, and balance the life standard of those living in the system. It also had organized trade bureaus to trade with major strategic trade partners like Soviet Union. And the opposite side of the coin is that it also organized trade blockade against the KMT region. So the KMT region has no, basically they have, for the most time, they have limited, and for some time they will have no access to the grain from the grain producing region. And if you compare with the KMT, I think the comparison is quite striking, because if you look at KMT, whereas the CCP has a multiple local currencies, right? We talk about the system as extremely decentralized. The KMT had a quite centralized system, right? They had a unified currency called 9 Province Circulation Bill, 九省流通券. Even before they can conquer the whole of Manchuria. So the whole Manchuria is already monetarily unified, even before they can actually conquer it. It has a centralized control by economic professionals, right? So the leading member of the KMT's economic committee in Manchuria is Zhang Jiao, who is one of the most important economists and a banker in modern Chinese history. So he was in charge of managing the monetary system. Whereas for the CCP, as we know, most people actually have no economic, of course, they don't have economic degree, but moreover, they don't even have economic education. Their experience was accumulated during the war, and moreover, as working for the logistics. And also, the KMT has this grand idea of jumpstart economy based on seized industrial assets from Japan. But as we know, this does not materialize because the Soviet Union, the Soviet troops eventually took most of those prized assets. They dismantled the factories. They took them apart and shipped them to Soviet Union. So eventually, they don't really have the assets. Whereas the CCP, although they also have this idea of using captured assets, they quickly adopted different systems that use grain as the key commodity to support the currency. So eventually, we can see the performance comparison. So although the CCP controlled region of Manchuria also experienced hyperinflation, but it's just no way to compare with the KMT system. I think Mara might have talked about KMT inflation in Shanghai and other major cities, but in Manchuria, it's basically even worse. It's already lost its value. So the 九省券 already lost most of its value and become basically like a trash paper by 1947. So it has to be merged with Fabi. And eventually, as we know, Fabi eventually collapsed. So what is this monetary system that CCP has organized and managed in Manchuria? While we can talk about its monetary or its money, it's actually a series of monies, especially in this period. So before 1947, there were actually more than 20 different circulation bills. As I have talked about, the system is extremely decentralized. So each region, each county even, has its own banks and issue its own currencies. But all those were eventually consolidated, merged into Dongbei Bi, which is the proper, let's say, fiat currency issued by the Bank of Manchuria, by the Dongbei Bank, which is like the central bank that CCP ran during this period. And eventually, in 1951, it merges into renminbi. So Dongbei is, in fact, one of its first regions to have its own mega currency, but it's actually one of the last regions to join renminbi, right? So renminbi was formed first in North China, and then it moved to South. And eventually, it incorporated all those different currencies of China, like Dongbei Bi. So here are some of those currencies that were in circulation. This is actually a Manchukuo currency, which is still, very interestingly, still in circulation until 1947 because of its stability. So this is the one that actually collapsed first. This is a KMT currency. And this is the Dongbei Bi. I think it's this is in 1950, right? This is already, when we already have renminbi, but Dongbei Bi is still the dominant currency in Manchuria. So what does this So how does the CCP actually stabilize the currencies and maintain control over the economy? As we said, Chuka is a very important factor because after the Manchurian pattern have experienced almost a decade of exploitations by the Japanese and also by the landlords, they become extremely frustrated. Some of these people actually went to the mountains and rivers. They become bandits, right? Some of these people, they joined the army, and other people, they run away from the homes. And when the CCP come, they see it as a very good opportunity to mobilize the patterns. So Chuga become a very important factor in the mobilization of the patents against local landlords in the land reform in Manchuria. But what happened after the land reform? In a way, it's interestingly a restoration of the Chuka system, right? Because after the land reform, when the CCP took control of the land, the government, after they distributed all the land, they established very strong local cells and militias and controls over the peasant society and penetrated very deeply into the agricultural society. And by emotionally mobilizing the peasants for the grievances, they can convert the grievances into some kind of mobilizational drive to join the army. And eventually what we see is that although the Chuga system was abolished after the Japanese was defeated, the CCP instituted a new system of tax grain and procurement. Of course, this is putting another light, it's a patriotic procurement. It's for the liberation, right? It's for the good of the people, but eventually it's still a procurement system. It's still coercive. Although it has not really reached the level, right, of the Chuka system. You can see this is the grain production. This is the level of mobilization under the Japanese and under the communists. So the communist mobilization is not as severe or destructive as the the Japanese, but it's a mobilization. It reaches a staggering 38% of all grain product produced by 1950. Right? It never reached the Japanese level, of course, but it's a very high level. So this is how the monetary system actually worked. The world has money to begin to circulate through grain procurement. So it's kind of a tax, right, on the peasants. And the grain goes to the state commerce system, and the money will circulate to the rural household. In the rural household, they will need the money to buy the seed, to buy implements, and to buy all other daily necessities. And via private merchants, they exchange with the city market. And also, the CCP banks also issue money to the urban household, right? So urban household get money as salaries. So basically, the money began to circulate between the rural sector, the urban sector, and the banks. And also, part of it also goes to the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. So the most important, or the linchpin of this circulation, is really between the exchange of grain, tax grain, and the money, right? The money the bank issued to the army and to the urban household. So it's always backed up. So the money issued is always backed up by a certain kind of grain procurement. And in the open market, they will use the grain store to adjust the price level. So I will just give a few examples of how this whole system was operationalized. I think the first important tactic is strategic trade with the Soviet Union and the Soviet sphere. So the key question is how to use your grain to trade for war material. Because as we know, the CCP only controlled north of Manchuria during much of the whole period. So although North Manchuria is a breadbasket, it produces a lot of grain, it does not produce some of those important commodities, right, like textiles. It does not produce some of the war materials, like war equipment, right? So they have to use grain to trade for those war materials. But before 1947, the Soviet Union was not very forthcoming in establishing the trade relationship, because, as we know, something very important, right, happened in 1947, the Cold War, right? Before the Cold War, the Soviet Union were still sort of seeking a kind of stable relation with KMT. They don't want to intervene too much on the side of the CCP. But after 1947, because of the Cold War, and then because there is a big famine in Soviet Union itself, Stalin eventually changed his idea. So in 1947, and from that onward, Soviet Union began to trade very heavily with the Northeast region under the CCP control. So basically, we can see that after 1997, the trade basically took off, right? Soviet trade took off, and also North Korean trade. So the Northeast region, the trade with Soviet Union for war materials, and the trade with North Korean for timber and all other materials. Whereas the trade with other part of the world, right? Let's say the world, but the world is really small at that time, right? Because of the war, they can only maintain a certain limited degree of trade with so-called inland China, with the KMT region. So when you think about this, Northeast China as part of China itself, most of this trade, over 90% of this trade, right, is with Soviet Union at this time, at the point of 1949. And most of them, 40% more, is in terms of grain. This is a very important factor, I think, in determining the shape of Northeastern China's geopolitics in the early 50s, because it basically become very much dependent, right? Or mutually dependent. There's a mutual dependence between Soviet Union and Northeast China, where war materials in support of war will, and the North China's grain surplus become a stable pair of exchange. So that's key factor, in fact, in the subsequent wars between the CCP and the KMT, because without this trade, the CCP can never get enough war materials to support its expanding army. But there are all other very interesting tactics that it employed, sometimes with market, sometimes without market, to wage economic warfare and also to control price levels. And so this is another example. This is the exchange, how to get rid of Manchukuo yuan. Right, Manchukuo yuan, as I said, is the money that were issued by the Japanese puppet regime in Manchukuo before 1945. But simply because its number is not so great, the quantity is not so great, and its quality is quite good, it remained in circulation well into 1947. How to get rid of those while making a profit? So the CCP financial managers, they had a very good idea. First, they raised the price of the procurement price and lower the selling price of grain, not in terms of Dongbei bi, right, but in terms of Manchukuo bi. So they want to trade this in Manchukuo dollar. And the peasants are very happy to sell because they have a lot of Manchukuo bi. And also want to buy, right? They want to buy back used Manchukuo bi. They want to sell the grains, right? They want to buy used Manchukuo bi, other daily necessities. And most of those money, the Manchukuo money actually flew into Harbin Trade Bureau shops and the CCP banks. And they, with a lot of Manchukuo bi, Manchukuo dollar, the CCP financial agency then raised the procurement price of textiles, where there's a shortage of, remember there's a shortage of textiles, shortage of clothes, right? To lure traders from the KMT region. So because at this part of time, Manchukuo dollar is in high demand in both CCP and also the KMT region. So the merchants from the KMT region flock to sell the textiles in North Manchuria. And this will recycle the excessive Manchukuo dollar to the KMT whole region. And then once they had enough textile product to make the military uniforms, the CCP ordered Manchukuo dollar to be void, illegal, right? So once they have enough, it become illegal, and the KMT had to follow suit. The outcome is that without using any sort of resources, they increase the stock of textiles. Actually, they use some of the resources. They use the monopoly of grain, right? But eventually, they acquire a lot of textile products. So this is one example of how they operationalize the system. The other example is how they use anti-speculation measure to control inflation. So in 1947, because there's massive mobilization of grain and also the army in the front, there's grain shortage, and there's a lot of rumors on the market that grain will be in short supply. So at this time, basically, there's a very large black market coexist alongside with the official market. So first, the Trade Bureau learned that black market price rose to 65 Dongbei per jin of grain, right? So they try to dump the market. They try to sell their surplus grain at a price of 30. And that increases supply, and the black market price returned a bit. But after the price returned, they had second thought. They want to use this opportunity to withdraw excessive Dongbei currency. So remember how they withdrew the currency is to sell product, right? But then they need to raise so first they experiment with raising the official price of grain again, just to recycle back some of the Dongbei. But the price spiral follows. So the black market price eventually increased like a spiral very soon into 200 Dongbei per jin. So the mission basically failed. So at that point of time, I think in the document, they clearly wrote expectation. There's some kind of expectation going on, right? So they did some investigation into the matter, and they find that the expectation of price increase is so high that even the public unit like schools, even the army unit, they also sell their grains. They also intervened in the market against the trade bureaus. So the trade bureaus realized that there's a limit of market control. So after this failure in 1948, the Trade Bureau Harbin, they began to implement the rationing system. So eventually they realized that only the rationing system will work. So this is, of course, a failed case of price control, but also it showed something, right? It showed that when the price control system does not work, the CCP were very happy to switch to other measures. So what is the consequences of using grain, monopolizing grain, and use as a kind of weapon, right, to manipulate money and to squeeze your enemy? I think there are two sets of consequences. So for the CCP controlled area, there were massive militarization because they were, in order to procure a lot of grain, you have to stage a lot of land reforms in a very violent way. And only militarization will eventually deal with the consequences of those violent land reforms. And in the cities, you have to establish a hierarchical rationing system, 供给制, centralized supply system. So eventually there were kind of de facto demonetization specific factors, where eventually people were given concrete commodities like grains or clothes instead of money. Whereas in the KMT controlled area, because they are deprived of basic commodities like grain, there were hyperinflation. The money became papers. And there were massive deprivations, and the extreme cases even famine. And that happened in the case of Changchun, the siege of Changchun in 1948. As some of you might know, that hundreds of thousands of people, civilians, eventually perished in that siege, simply because of the famine, simply because basically the CCP army controlled the grains and they disallowed, right, the civilians to pass the siege. So in conclusion, how do we understand the monetary operations and how does it serve the military purpose? I think we can probably summarize the findings into first a few logics of how commodity-based money actually work. So for producers, the rural residents, the monetary expansion means grain excessive procurement and increased production. The more money means you have to increase grain production, but also procurement. For the consumers, that's the urban residents, it means monetary authority. The more money you issued, eventually you have to reduce the consumer product supplies, because money in this sense were actually based on grain, right? It's backed by grains. And in order to tackle with excessive expansion, sometimes you have to use deurbanization and rustication as a measure. So that's why in the CCP system, in the rationing system, you always see period of expansion and then a long period of austerity. And that was the case, especially salient in the experience of in the Great Leap Forward and the subsequent famine. And for the enemy population, it's even worse. It means deprivation of even essential commodities. So I think Manchuria resource, if we extrapolate a bit, we can see that the Manchuria experience was still very relevant, right, for both for the Chinese Civil War, because eventually the communists were able to win the Civil War, and they can fight stalemate in the Korean War. And one of the very important factors is the monopoly over Manchuria grain, and they can trade grain for strategic materials from Soviet Union. They also can use the grain to stabilize price and support the renminbi. So basically, that's why I think the Manchuria experience, and especially the experience with grain-backed money, is very important in the evolution of renminbi. Thank you very much.